we don't have time to go and have fun with all the people we want to have fun with. It's been difficult, and I continually have these feelings that I'm just not doing enough. For me personally, the pandemic started terribly. In early March, right before lockdown, one of my best friends took his own life, and it was extremely unexpected. And his funeral was on March 9th, my birthday. Then lockdown happened immediately after that. And my son, who lives in Virginia during the school year, had to cancel his plans to be in Michigan during spring break. It was really tough and really devastating. And then my house just seems to be continually messy. I wasn't practicing my bass. I was seeing lots of people on Zoom, but it just didn't feel the same. And then also this summer, one of my cats passed away. And simply just going to the store gives me anxiety. I had to miss my cousin's wedding in Colorado. He was the best man in my wedding. I couldn't see my parents and my friends and all the people that I wanted to, including you guys. So after all this, I have to say the pandemic has been great. There came a point where I realized that I am doing enough and that we're all doing enough. This is a situation in a time where everyone feels a little screwed up. But I sat back and started thinking, is it true that I'm not doing enough, or am I just focusing on the wrong things? I've spent more time outdoors than I have ever had. I had a wonderful garden. I saved 3 raccoons this summer and a pit bull, different day. I fixed the fridge and the dishwasher on my own, and I put up a new front door.
Wow.
I spent way too much money on Amazon, and you probably did too. I helped create a bike ride through Flint. Then I created one, I helped, I don't want to take full credit. Then I helped create one through Detroit. I have listened to more jazz than I've ever been able to before. I became much closer to my neighbors because of this. Even Reg Lancaster will walk by and chat every once in a great while. I had the best summer I had ever had with my son, even though it was cut short because of COVID. I learned comedy from Steve Martin. I learned the art of magic from Penn and Teller. Scientific thinking and communication from Neil deGrasse Tyson. This summer, I also learned gardening from Ron Finley, whose garden is set in an old pool in urban Los Angeles. I learned space exploration from NASA astronaut Chris Hadfield, and jazz from Herbie Hancock. I even joined a golf league with Rob Bennett, which we are in last place, by the way. And during this time, I laughed with my wife more than I've ever laughed before. The point is, whatever you're doing or have been doing in these last 7 months, it's enough. We're all figuring this out. There's no handbook. There's no roadmap for this. We're all doing the best we can and trying to work with the cards that have been dealt to us. We all go through these feelings of not being enough or not doing enough. It's a normal feeling, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. What I would like you to remember about what I'm saying today is to focus on the positives. Sometimes that can actually be more difficult, but I would venture to guess that if you can approach your days in this manner, then you'll be able to look yourself in the mirror and realize that you are doing enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. You scared me when you said, not me.
I didn't want to leave that hanging there too long, so I quickly cut it.
So Nick, it's okay that I've washed the windows outside 4 times now, which I normally would do once.
I would think so. And if you want to come do it over here,
wash, let me know. I'll come over and wash windows. I get so bored, I just go back and wash windows again.
If you need any tomatoes, let me know.
Okay, next slide, please. Are there any updates or reports on the health of Rotary members? Anyway,
I have one. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you, President?
no, go right ahead.
I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to do that. John Mott's been under the weather and have been able to visit with him. And I said, is there anything you'd like me to say to the Rotary Club of Flint? And he said, please wish him my very best. And best wishes for health. And as we go forward as an organization, he's feeling very positive that we will survive this pandemic and regrow the club back. Now, I think most of you know John Mott, do you not? He's a past president of the club years ago. And I just wanted to give you that health update and his comments.
Bob, is he home?
He is home.
Would it be worthwhile to send him a card?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Yes.
Anyone else? We can move to the next slide.
Nice.
Our guests for today, we've had two guests that introduced themselves. That was Crystal and Julie. And welcome to those two. Are there any other? Okay. Announcements. World Polio Day, Saturday, October the 24th, and United Nations Day is also on that same day. And in Polio Now, and our board is going to meet just to discuss that issue, to see if there's anything that the board, the club in particular, that the board would want the club in particular to do. So we will be in touch. And there's Al. Hi, Al. Al Tucker. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine.
Good, good. Okay, next slide, please. Rotary Leadership Institute. We've got one person that has registered. You did get to register, didn't you, Elizabeth?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention that this is available and on this date. And this is part one only right now. But what it's about is really learning the ins and outs and the basics of Rotary. So I wanted to see this just in case you wanted to get involved, get registered. And the club will take care of your registration if you choose to do so. Any questions?
Ray, this is Al. I would just encourage all, particularly new members. It says Rotary Leadership Institute, but it's actually Rotary Leadership and Learning Institute. So by taking this, you'll learn a lot about Rotary, but it doesn't necessarily put you on a fast track to leadership if that's not in the cards for you at this moment. But if you want to learn something about Rotary, particularly at the district and international level, these Rotary Leadership and Learning Institutes are good ways to do that.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Now it's time for our speaker. Kyle, you have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Paul Ruzicki, and you are front and center.
Thank you, President Ray. Before I introduce Paul, I do want to make note in the chat, I just put two links in. Information from the League of Women Voters in their vote411.org website for voter information, where candidates have submitted information up and down the ballot. And this will also be printed in the journal this Sunday if you get the paper. And also I put in the Michigan Voter Information Center. As you know, we have changed some voter laws in the state. And if you want to Vote absentee, see when your ballot was mailed. If you drop it off or you mail it, if you want to check to see if it's been received by your clerk or any other election or voting questions, the Secretary of State's website is there, and that's the Voter Information Center. So those links are in the chat. I just wanted to put those out there as nonpartisan resources. Rob Jewell, our government relations chair, I want to thank him in his absence for his support in working to bring this speaker of having Paul with us today. Although many of us know Paul, I do want to take a few minutes, a minute or two, to just introduce Paul formally, and for those who don't know him, or maybe to learn a little bit about Paul's background. So Paul Ruzicki is a retired professor of political science at Mott Community College. Paul came to teaching somewhat accidentally. He planned a career as a journalist, having worked for a daily newspaper in Illinois for about 5 years. After his undergraduate education at Northern Illinois and graduate school in Indiana, at University of Indiana, he taught political science at Ball State. So for you keeping notes, Paul is both a Husky and a Hoosier from Northern Illinois and IU. After teaching at Ball State for a couple of years, he came to Mott Community College in 1969. He established a long track record teaching political science. He was also faculty advisor to the student newspaper and editor of the faculty union newsletter at the college. Paul retired in 2011, but continues to teach classes occasionally at the college. So he has a long track record that he's been honored for numerous venues for his service to the college. Paul has continued to be on our airwaves and in our lives as somewhat of a multimedia political analyst here in our community. He has been a weekly commentator on the Tom Sumner radio program on WFOV. He oftentimes moderates panels in the community, or you'll see him on the evening news analyzing political or election issues. And he's a regular columnist for the East Village magazine in Flint and is president of the East Village magazine board. And so without any further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today, Paul Ruzicki.
Thank you, Kyle. This is a little different kind of format than we usually have, and it's a very different kind of election, to be sure. Given our time, there are so many issues going on today, it's almost hard to pick where to start. What I'm going to do, I think, is kind of start with a little overview of the election in general, say a few things about the presidential election, about why Trump could win or Biden could win, take a look at some statewide races, and then as time permits, take a look at some local races as well, and maybe some thoughts. And I do want to leave a lot of time for questions, and frankly, even as I'm speaking, I'm not sure how well it works with Zoom, but feel free to interrupt at any time with questions, because almost everything I say has got some sidebar issue that's worth talking about, almost an entire lecture itself. So let me start off with a little bit of an overview of what strikes me as the strangest election that I can ever recall in my lifetime. I mean, it's clearly the most divisive one. I mean, in the late 60s, we were a very divided society, but I think this year, the election itself is far more divisive than then. And looking forward, the implications are maybe more worrisome. I mean, not only are we divided, but what's going to happen afterward? Will the Electoral College work, or will it fall apart in some ways? Is democracy itself at risk? There's a great level of distrust in all institutions, whether it's the presidency, the Congress, the media, educational institutions, and so many others. And really, what does it all say about the future of the nation in some ways? So it's really dramatic in a lot of ways. On the other hand, one of the other strange things about this year is the fact that for all the huge events that we've had, so much hasn't changed. I mean, within this last year, if you look back, we've had an impeachment, the COVID pandemic, an economic collapse, very serious, deep racial divisions, the Supreme Court debates going on right now, the tumultuous first debate, the plot to kidnap Whitmer. And yet, if you take a look at the polls, Trump's support stays about the same. It's been around 42% for the last year, and in some ways the last 3 years. It'll bump up a couple of points or bump down a couple of points, but it's been in the same ballpark for a long time. So that may be one of the stranger things, is that for all the huge tumultuous events we've had, in terms of support or lack of support for the president, it hasn't had much effect. The other thing worth noting, I think, is that this is the pandemic election. I mean, there's a lot of issues around. I'll mention a few of those, but almost everything you come down to does touch in some way on the pandemic, whether it's the economy, whether it's how we vote, with the mail-in voting issue, which has caused all kind of turmoil in some ways. It's clearly the main reaction of both candidates has been their reaction or lack of reaction to the pandemic. So as I say, all kind of things are really playing a major role in this process that make this the most significant, most divisive, and maybe most tumultuous election of all time. So let me start off, first of all, by taking a look at a number of reasons why Trump could win the election. Right now, clearly, the polls show him significantly behind, but that was also true in 2016. So the polls can be pretty accurate, but again, I'll take them with a grain of salt until it's all said and done after 2016. But let me take a look at some of the reasons why Trump could possibly win this thing. First of all, he's the incumbent. Incumbents always have an advantage. We've only defeated 2 incumbents in the last roughly half century. Jimmy Carter and H.W. Bush, both of those really faced a loss because of a tough economy during their re-election campaigns. So as I say, as an incumbent president, you've almost always got a built-in advantage, and we've got a long-standing habit of re-electing incumbents. A second advantage Trump has got is that the economy, the old James Carville line, "It's the economy, stupid," remains true. And if Trump has anything going for him, it's the economy. You take a look at polls, and while people certainly have turned on him in terms of the pandemic, in terms of race relations, and a lot of other things, still in general, by a shrinking majority, but still a majority, he does have the edge in the economy. So to the extent the economy remains relatively good or maybe less bad than we thought, that may be an advantage for Trump as well. The court appointments we're seeing played out almost as we speak this past week will give him an advantage, especially with evangelicals, reminding them one reason why they supported him to a great degree. By most estimates, 80% or so evangelical Christians went for Trump. Those Supreme Court discussions will remind them of that fact again. What's really interesting here is that for all there's really a great conflict going on in the Republican Party. On one hand, most Republicans are staying dramatically loyal to Trump. 90% or more of Republicans are staying loyal to him. And that's a little bit higher than most other Republican presidents. It's in the high 80s, 85, 88%. So Trump's loyalty is higher than usual. On the other hand, the Lincoln Project represents Republicans who are getting pretty sick of him and are going in a different direction. So I'll say more about that when I talk about the Biden campaign. The other effect is that if he can pick up the older, disaffected white Reagan Democrats in places like Macomb County, that may be a big advantage as well. There's a great distrust in the system, and even though he's the incumbent, he's almost running like an outsider. And for those folks who distrust the system, who are kind of mad as hell at everything else, he may still attract those kind of voters in some ways. The one surprising area where he's shown some gains, and to me is very surprising, is with Hispanic voters. And for all the attacks he's done on immigration and things he said about Hispanics over the years, there is, especially in Florida, some signs that the Hispanic voters are giving him somewhat greater support now than they gave most Republicans and that they gave him 4 years ago. Now, one other advantage is that, and this is kind of ironic in one sense, that all the good news that Biden is getting from the polls, and most polls are now showing Biden up by 10, 12 points or more. Predictions are fairly strong that Biden's got a good chance of winning. But in one sense, again, that happened in 2016. In one sense, the danger of that is that may make Democrats overconfident and cause them to stay home or vote for a third party or just not get involved at all. That seems to have happened in 2016. If that happens again this year, that could be another great advantage for Trump as well. In a somewhat similar vein, on the enthusiasm issue, when you take a look at rallies, the kind of enthusiasm Trump has generated for his rallies is remarkable. And the only rough parallel I can think of, and I'm not even sure that's an exact one, is if you go back to the days of Bobby Kennedy back in the late 60s, maybe you'd find somewhat similar enthusiasm for a candidate. But the kind of turnout and energy that is at those rallies where folks camp out overnight to go to one of his rallies is very unusual, particularly compared to the kind of enthusiasm you're seeing for Biden at his kind of rallies. The other advantage Trump has had, and he's had this all the time, is he dominates the media. I mean, it's the Trump show, whether it's the town hall forum last night or anything else. He has been the master of for all the complaints he has about the fake news and the fake media. He has played the media very well. He gets more airtime than anybody else, and he does dominate the media because, frankly, it's good copy. He's a good show. Like I say, so is the train wreck, but it does make good copy and gets a lot of attention. And then one final thing for Trump, if by any chance he gets a vaccine or a cure before Election Day, that doesn't seem likely at the moment, but if that should happen, that too will be a big plus. So those are some of the reasons why Trump might be able to pull this thing off. Now, having said that, there's an awful lot of reason why Biden might have an inside track here. First of all, if Biden can rebuild what's called the blue wall, the blue wall are those states that, except for 16, that have voted Democratic for the last 30 plus years. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, sometimes Ohio, a few others as well. And that was one reason why a lot of folks, myself included, felt that Hillary had the thing in the bag in 2016, is that nobody thought that Trump would breach that so-called blue wall. And he did. He carried a number of those states, those so-called Rust Belt states that had gone Democratic for a long time. If Biden can rebuild that, and the numbers seem to suggest he's doing that, if he can rebuild that, that's going to give him an enormous advantage in the Electoral College and the popular vote as well. Secondly, if Biden can regain what I'm calling the Obama-Trump voters, you know, Trump is often portrayed as a racist to some degree, and he may well be from some of his actions. But there was a number of voters who voted for Obama once or twice, and then voted for Trump in 16. Well, again, their main reason may have been they simply wanted something different, voted for a change, the outsider, that kind of thing. But if Biden can tap into those Obama-Trump voters, that too can be a great plus for Biden this year around. The anti-Trump Republicans are, again, one remarkable thing about this year is you are seeing a significant number of Republicans in this Lincoln Project and others who have basically said, we've had it with Trump, we're Republicans, but we're not voting Republican this year for president, we're going for Biden. You don't see those numbers in most election years, and they are significant. And some, again, fairly big names, the McCain family, among many others, have come out very strongly for Biden this year. One other big issue this year is, where does the military vote? The military vote traditionally has been very Republican. But for some of the things Trump has said about the military, you know, calling them losers or suckers of one kind, or say he doesn't like folks who are held prisoner and all of that, you're seeing more and more a disaffection from some traditional Republican voters among the military families and military supporters. A real big thing, I think, also is this next one, what I simply call Trump fatigue. There are so many folks who are just simply exhausted by the Trump show. Whether you like him or dislike him or like his policies or don't like his policies, no matter how you cut it, it's an exhausting kind of candidacy. In fact, what's kind of curious is that in some ways this is almost a repeat of an event of a slogan that happened 100 years ago. Not only are we having a pandemic after 100 years, but in 1920, after the years of Woodrow Wilson and World War I, the Republican slogan that year is "Let's return to normalcy," and Harding won that year. In some degrees, in some sense, you're seeing the Biden campaign, although it hasn't used the slogan, build on that idea of let's get back to something normal. Let's end the chaos, the turmoil, the revolving door at the White House. So the Trump fatigue, I think, is a big factor as well. Another big factor is larger turnout. Turnout was down a little bit in 16. A lot of folks who normally voted Democratic, especially in urban areas, did not turn out. If there is a larger turnout, and it looks like that's going to be the case from early indications, that probably is going to be a big plus for Biden, I would guess. Big issue is suburban women. Suburban women normally a bit more Republican, but again, in light of some of Trump's comments over the years and his actions over the years, current indications are that traditionally Republican suburban women are turning on Trump and going for Biden as well. Older voters in 16 went for Trump by a substantial margin. Again, this year, it looks like from the current polls that older voters in places like Florida, among many other areas, are pulling back from that support, partially over health care issues, but over also style itself, I think. If that holds true, that too will be another big loss for Trump and a plus for Biden. And as I say, the thing overriding everything is the pandemic election and health care. I mean, to the extent that the pandemic remains the main issue, and all indications are it will, maybe even more so in 2.5 weeks, that clearly is going in Biden's favor by almost a 2-to-1 margin. The American public feels that Biden is doing a much better job in dealing with the pandemic and giving Trump very low marks in his handling of that whole issue. And as I say, Trump's polls remain low in the low 40% range. No president has won re-election with those kind of polls so far. And again, most of the polls also, even for all the worries we hear about the polls back in 16, nearly all the polls are showing Biden doing significantly better than Hillary in 16. So again, all of those suggest that, there's a pretty good case to be made that Biden's, at the moment at least, has got the inside track. But having said that, you need to be cautious in large part because those things were said in 16 and we were surprised on election day. So as I say, that's kind of the real big thing, I think, is what happens after the election. Will we be able to restore trust in the electoral process? Will there be legal challenges to the election that might drag on for a while? With the mail-in voting, is that going to take a long time before we have results? We're used to having results by 11 o'clock or so on election night. That probably won't be the case this year. Will that open the door to charges of fraud or of one kind or another, and legal challenges perhaps in the Supreme Court as well? And then again, in light of the attempted the planned kidnapping of Governor Whitmer, is there a threat of violence after the election if somebody's not happy with the results? So there's, again, this is an unusual election, not only for the election proper, but for what could happen after the election. So a lot to watch. And as I say, we may not know what the real meaning of this election is for weeks or maybe months after in some ways. Having said that, let me now turn a little bit to some statewide races. Not too many really hot things statewide, but a couple things worth mentioning. The biggest one here is the U.S. Senate race. Gary Peters, the incumbent Democrat, John James, the Republican. Most polls give Peters a slight edge, but not a hefty one, 3, 4, 5 points, depending on the poll you're looking at. And James is proving to be a formidable candidate. He ran for the first time against Debbie Stabenow 4 years ago, and although he lost, he did surprisingly better than expected. He put together a very solid campaign. Real question there is, will the fact that James is an African American, will he be able to pull African American voters away from the Democrats for Gary Peters? Peters is not as well known as Stabenow. When we talk about the U.S. Senate, we usually divide them into two categories: the so-called show horses and the so-called workhorses. The show horses are the ones who are on the media a lot, who come back to their districts and do all the public relations kind of things and are getting very well known. The workhorses are the ones who show up for committee meetings, who do the nitty-gritty work of passing bills and writing legislation, but very often aren't quite so well known. It's fair to say that Stabenow was a bit more of a show horse. Peters was much more of a workhorse, and that, again, during an election campaign can be a problem. As I say, what's interesting about the James campaign, though, is that when I've seen his ads, he has gone out of his way to not mention Trump for the most part, with one or two exceptions, to not mention Trump much at all. So he's really, it seemed like, distancing himself from Trump as much as possible. And assuming Michigan goes for Biden, as it looks like it might, that's probably a wise move on his part. But that's going to be a key election, because in large part, if the Democrats want to gain control of the Senate, they've got to gain 3 or 4 seats, and they can't afford to lose Michigan. So, as I say, there are, if you look around the nation, there's probably 3 or 4 potential seats they could gain in some areas, but they can't afford to lose Michigan. They're probably going to lose Alabama. There's probably 4 other states where Republicans have got really more at stake this year for the Senate than do the Democrats. This year, there are 23 Republicans defending their seats, only a dozen Democrats. So, as I say, the numbers are pretty good, but as I say, incumbents do tend to win re-election. It's not going to be easy to pick up those 3 or 4 seats. I mentioned 3 or 4 because, in large part, if Biden wins, they only need 3 seats, because they'll have a Democratic vice president. If Trump wins, they'll need 4 seats to gain the Senate race. On top of that, I'll just make a brief mention here in light of the time that the other significant statewide race is the Supreme Court race, significant in large part in light of the Supreme Court's ruling a week or so ago on the governor's emergency powers. The other statewide things worth looking at are 2 proposals that will be on the statewide ballot that have gotten, frankly, very little attention and can be of some consequence. Proposal 20-1, the first one of the year, it's a complicated proposal that, frankly, probably should have been worked out in some legislative committee, because it is a complex process. Basically, what it would do, if it passes, it would redirect the tax funds gained from oil and gas revenue to various environmental groups. It would change the existing law. And as I say, the law is a complex thing. There are various financial caps and various percentages that go to various departments in the state government. I won't go into all that. The bottom line is this. The distinction here is between those who want to maintain the existing process, where most of the money goes to the acquisition of new property, and let me back up here. If it passes, the funds will be allocated to maintain and improve existing state environmental properties. If it fails, more of those funds will go to acquire new properties. That's kind of the simple one-line definition of it. Again, there's a lot of detail about percentages and dollar amounts going to various departments. In general, you find a significant number of environmental groups supporting it. However, also some environmental groups have also opposed it as well. So there's a division within the environmental community on Proposal 20-1. But again, the key issue is whether you want to simply use the money to maintain existing parks, or have the money acquire more parks and more property for environmental purposes. That's kind of the one line definition of that one. And Proposal 22 is far simpler and far clearer in many ways. Basically, what that would do if it passes, it would require a search warrant to acquire personal electronic data for phones, computers, things of that nature. And again, it looks like widespread support for that. That's probably a far simpler arrangement. On the local level here in Genesee County, a number of interesting contests worth looking at, and some very predictable ones as well. On one hand, Dan Kildee running for re-election in the 5th District against Tim Kelly. Very likely a safe seat for Kildee. That's long been a Democratic stronghold. The Kildee name has had a long base in the area. However, Kelly is getting more funds than most Republicans get this year. He's putting on a bit of a stronger campaign. But for Dan Kildee, I don't see that as a particularly close race, and probably a safe Democratic race. There are a number of races around here for the State House, though. Most of those are safe Democratic races that I'll mention in a second. But the one worth watching is the 48th District. That's the northern tier of Genesee County, northern tier of townships of Genesee County. where the incumbent Democrat Cheryl Kennedy is being challenged by Republican David Martin, who's been on the county board in the past. That district has been Democratic in the past. It's got a decent Democratic base, about 62%, but it's been close for Democrats recently. And it also went for Trump by a significant margin. In fact, if you look at Genesee County, a little sidebar thought here. If you look at Genesee County, we think it's a Democratic county, and it is. But when you look at the 2016 election, it's really kind of like a donut hole. The central part of the county, city of Flint, Burton, Genesee Township, Flint Township, and Grand Blanc areas, they went Democratic, they went for Hillary. But the out county area, the donut, outside the donut hole, all went for Trump in Genesee County. So that's caused some concern among Democrats who normally win in those areas. So again, the Kennedy-Martin race, probably the one to watch, and really getting an awful lot of attention, a lot of TV and media advertising for that campaign. Beyond that, the other races here are generally safe for the incumbents. Democrats, John Sherry is running against Brian Lutz in the 49th district. Strong Democratic base, probably safe for Sherry, I would think. Tim Sneller, also probably safe Democrat in his district, the 50th district in southeastern Genesee County. Cynthia Neely in much of northern and central Flint, Democrat, running against James Maragala, Republican. Very solid Democratic base there. And then in southern Genesee County, Republican Mike Mueller in the 51st district. Pretty solid Republican base there. Probably a safe Republican district down in southern Genesee County. The county offices, I won't go through all of them, given that I'm going to try and give you time for questions here as well. Sheriff Chris Swanson running for his first full term against Stephen Sanford. Again, strong Democratic county in general in that area. Probably Swanson is safe, but more of a race than you normally see. A number of the other county officials are running either unopposed or with fairly minimal opposition. David Layton, Deb Cherry, Kim Crawford, John Gleason, again, either unopposed or facing relatively nominal opposition in large part. So as I say, a couple of hot races here, but Genesee County remains still a strong Democratic county. But as I say, you're seeing some shifting sands based upon 16, where a significant part of the county went Republican for Trump, and that's got to cause some concern for the Democratic Party within this traditional Democratic area. A lot of other things on the ballot here, in large part. Again, I'll just make brief mentions. A lot of judicial races of great consequence here in Genesee County. School boards all over the place. Every township has got an election of some kind. There are city council races going on in a variety of cities and villages all over the place. Vermont College has got an election going on for its board of trustees. And then I'm going to just a couple of final thoughts to kind of pull things together about what we're looking at after the election. One thing to watch for here is the Electoral College. I mean, in 16, for the second time in, at that time, 16 years, we had someone who had the most votes, most popular votes, lose the Electoral College. And I always used to say that before 2000, when I talked about the Electoral College, that if it ever failed in the modern age, the only previous time was 1888, or the previous time was 1888. If it only ever failed in the modern age, that we'd see a great move to get rid of it. Well, in 2000, Al Gore had the most votes by about 500,000, but lost the election. And there was a little discussion about getting rid of it, but it didn't go anywhere. Happened again in 16, and again, no serious discussion about getting rid of it really at this point. So it'll be worth watching. If the same thing happens again, if by any chance Trump clears the Electoral College, loses the electoral vote, will there be a move to, in some ways, change it or get rid of it in some way? Will there be charges of fraud and election challenges? Will this thing end up in courts? Maybe with a new justice on the Supreme Court. The one significant worry is that, like 2000, we could have to wait weeks before we know the final results. Another issue worth noting here is that normally vice presidents don't play a significant role in how people vote. And for all the talk you hear every election year about, who somebody should pick, whether you're going to balance it off with regard to geography or a moderate and a conservative, or a moderate and a liberal, or balance it off racially or gender-wise. Most survey shows that in most elections, the VPs don't matter much. But this year, with both presidents being in the mid-70s and beyond, some facing serious health issues, as in Trump's case, there may be a far greater emphasis on the role of vice presidents. There's a far greater chance that either vice president could take over, or certainly could be a major candidate in 2024. So probably much more emphasis on the VPs this year than you see in most years. And then let me make one more point, and then just go to some questions here, I think, in large part. Maybe 1 or 2 points. One question is, what are the parties going to look like in the future? I think we're seeing, in some way, a realignment of the parties. Some major groups that have gone for one party, talking about white blue-collar workers that tradition Democratic, looks like they're going Republican. And you're seeing others, upper-income, college-educated voters, going more Democratic. So I think we're going to have a big question in the years to come of what are the Republican and Democratic parties going to look like. How will campaigns change? Well, this is the strangest campaign. I mean, Trump's out there all the time having his rallies, but in many ways, we're going back to the old front porch campaigns of the 19th century, where we're doing things on the media or social media or otherwise, and that may change campaigns for a long time. And then finally, I think the real key thing, this goes back, covers so many issues. After the election is said and done, will the nation be able to restore trust in the whole election system, and the government in general? I think one thing we've seen lost here, and this starts with Flint, with our water crisis. We've seen trust lost in so many institutions, whether it's the local government here in Flint, whether it's the Congress, the White House, the media, to some degree even the military, the political parties. I think the biggest issue here is how much trust will be restored after this is all said and done. So that's kind of a quick overview of an awful lot of stuff happening this year, and I'll be glad to take any kind of questions or comments beyond that.
Paul,
Hey,
thank
Paul, I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, good to see you, Paul. You're great. I love listening to you. And we've talked many times through the years. But I guess my question is this. When Trump went out after he had COVID on that balcony, and he climbed up those steps and he walked across the balcony and he took off that mask, do you think that helped him or hurt him politically?
If you take a look at the polls, most of that stuff his supporters loved it, but you take a look at the general public, and by almost a 60-40 split, most of the voters thought that was a foolish move to make, especially when you see these spikes in the pandemic following the rallies and all that kind of event. So yeah, I mean, as I say, it made for a great show, and Trump loves a great show, but politically, I think it was a very foolish move in many ways.
Hey, Paul.
Sure.
What about District 48 with Cheryl? I didn't hear your remarks about Cheryl Kennedy and Dave Martin. I hear the DeVos Van Andels have put a ton of money in Martin's campaign. How do you think that's going to affect it?
Well, as I said, there's a ton of money there. You're seeing more TV advertising for a state house race than I've seen in a very long time. It's going to be a very competitive race. As I say, that district did go for Trump. It's been Democratic historically, but that Democratic margin is sinking in recent elections. And like I say, Trump carried it in 16, and Cheryl Kennedy's the first term state house member, and that's always a difficult election anyway. And as you say, Martin has put together a solid record. He's served a number of positions on the county board and locally in the Davison area. Plus, as you say, he's got some serious money behind him. So no, I would think that's the most competitive race, I think, in Genesee County. It's the one with Washington, the state house. I don't know if the Democrats have got a great chance to take over the state house. That's kind of a long shot. But if they do, they've got to hang on to that one in traditionally Democratic Genesee County.
Paul, this is Marie. I have a question about, this morning they were reporting that Nebraska's Republican Senator Sass had done this phone call to a lot of constituents, and it's very anti-Trump. What did you think of that?
Oh, I had not heard that story, but as I say, what does strike me this year is there's it's probably an exaggeration to call it a stampede, but there's more than a few Republicans, who are saying this. They've had it with Trump and are voting for Biden. I mean, not just the McCain family, but Kasich out of Ohio. Again, like the Lincoln Project has really pulled together a number of anti-Trump Republicans. Apparently, from the most indication, I'm not sure they've said they're voting for Biden yet, but even the Bush family, for the most part, is not going to support Trump. Where they're going, I'm not sure. But no, more so than almost any other year I can recall, you're seeing members of one party saying, we're not going to support our nominee. You might have to go back. The only other time I can think of something like that happening maybe was in 1964 with Barry Goldwater, where there were a significant number of Republicans who kind of held their nose on Goldwater that year. But I think even then, I think the numbers of Republicans turning on Trump are greater this year than any other year I can recall.
Well, the reason that this was brought up, I think the discussion was that so many of the reporters are saying that so many of the Republicans, the senators in particular, they say things not in private, and it's totally different when they come out. They're supportive of Trump when it comes out, and that this with Sass was something new, that he was public about it.
Well, I think here's one thing. Again, there's almost twice as many Republican senators running for re-election as Democrats. And if you're running for re-election and you see that your ties to Trump are hurting you, the reality of politics is going to play a role. And all of a sudden you'll say, yeah, maybe you're a loyal Trump supporter so far, but if it's going to cost you your job, all of a sudden you may pull the plug on it. And you may be seeing some of that. And you are seeing, frankly, some polls showing that kind of thing. If Trump's going to go down, you may not want to go down with him.
In 2016, Trump won by 10,000 votes. Is that correct?
Yeah, about actually 10,704.
Okay.
I have not forgotten that number.
Okay. So Chris Hayes from MSNBC held 3 town halls in Michigan last year, and that was brought up. A reporter from the Detroit News Free Press said that's not really the big number. The big number was that close to 90,000 people that voted in the general election voted for none of the above. Will that happen again?
It could. Actually, you raise a good point. Not only did some vote for none of the above, but a significant number. I think let me give you one quick example. Trump won Michigan by a bit over 10,000 votes. 50,000 people voted for the Green Party that year. And right. You can find somewhat similar numbers for a few other minor parties as well. So again, if you take a look at the folks who didn't vote for president and then those who voted for minor parties in somewhat larger than usual numbers, you could argue that, yeah, that's going to, that could have a big effect. So my guess is, this is purely a guess, is that you're going to see a smaller turnout for third parties. And I would think probably a smaller turnout for the none of the above. Because I think the thing that's going to drive this election, and I think we're going to see a larger turnout than ever, is that I think we're going to see the presidential contest is the far and away the hot button issue. The senatorial contest will matter a little bit. Some local ones may matter a little bit here and there. But I think it's the presidential contest is going to draw people to the polls. And for that reason, by the way, I think it's also true we're not going to see very many undecided voters. Many years you'll have 10 to 20%. This year so far, maybe 8 or 10%. My guess is less than that are truly undecided right now, because in large part a reaction to Trump, both pro and con. There are relatively few undecideds out there. Other comments, questions from anybody?
Hey,
Any more
Paul.
I got Paul.
Sure.
Paul,
This
why
is
don't you
Lynette.
answer Lynette Acona's question?
Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you. So listen, what's your feeling about the large turnout of voting that's already underway? Any feel for who's going out there? Largely one party over the other?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, all the indications are that the massive early turnout with absentee and mail-in voting has favored Democrats. Now, historically, that hasn't been true. If you take a look at the arguments you heard from people like Trump occasionally was, oh, gee, all this mail-in voting is going to help Democrats. That has not been historically true. Those states that had mail-in voting a lot, like Utah and a few others in the West, have had a strong Republican bias for some time. But this year, if you take a look at the numbers so far, the early indications are that the strong majority of those folks who are voting early are Democrats. And again, the mail-in voting is really going to increase turnout. It's kind of a separate topic, almost a separate presentation sometime. Is that I think one thing we may learn from this pandemic is that mail-in voting may have some real advantages. Not only does it give the voter a chance to cast the ballot at their leisure. You know, depending on your work schedule, when we go from 7 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, some people, depending on where they work and how they work, may not be able to make it to the polls. The other advantage that I really like about the mail-in voting is that it gives voters a chance to study the ballot. You know, if you're kind of an uncommitted voter who's not a political junkie like some of us are, you walk into the polls on election day, and yeah, you've heard about somebody running for president, you've heard about some of the senatorial race, you've heard about a few others, but then you come across this 6-paragraph proposal on the ballot that you know nothing about, you don't know what to do about this thing, and you're not going to sit there for half an hour and read the thing. You're going to go no on it. When you're at home and you've got the ballot in front of you, you can sit down and read through the proposals. You can go to a website. You can check and see who's endorsed it, who hasn't endorsed it, and make a much more reasoned judgment about that. So not only will it increase turnout, but I think it'll make voting, frankly, more intelligent than we've had in the past. So as I say, I think it's almost a side effect that, yeah, we're doing this because of the pandemic, but I think there may be some real advantages in keeping the mail-in voting option there for quite a while. And I say that as someone who I kind of enjoy the ritual of going into the polls myself every election day. It's kind of a nice ceremony to go through. But as I say, I think there's a lot to be said for mail-in voting for other reasons as well.
Paul, Jerry Hill, I had a question on Trump keeps talking about if he loses, he's not going to give up the presidency. Now, yeah. I mean, wouldn't it if they call in the new president, won't everything shut off for him?
Well, yeah, I mean, frankly, if it comes to that, I mean, with Trump, you never know how much of this stuff to believe. But I've never heard of a presidential candidate make a claim like that. Realistically, though, the fact is that, yeah, if he decided to camp out in the White House and not give up power, they could just turn off the power and turn off the lights and have the president inaugurated somewhere else and be president from the office if necessary. I mean, I don't think it's going to come to that. That's the kind of stuff you hear about in some, third world dictatorships. But again, it's one of the things that makes this election the strangest one ever is the mere possibility of that happening raises all kind of very strange options that could happen. Again, I don't think it's going to happen, but could happen this year around. And I say, I mean, if push comes to shove, the new president takes over at noon on January 20th, and Donald Trump is ex-president wherever he's sitting at the time, whether he's in the White House or sitting next to the new president or wherever else.
Nick, did you have a question?
Thank you, President. Okay, hey, Paul, so you were talking about in the Senate, show horses versus work horses. I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but it makes perfect sense.
Well, that was an old term I used to use for my poli-sci class.
Okay. And then John James's ads continually, I'm seeing a really strong push. His big knock against Peter is that he doesn't show up to work. And I guess my question is, because I kind of have what I think I see in it, but can you speak to the accuracy of that? And is it in context or is it out of context?
As far as I know, let me kind of back. all members of Congress miss certain kind of meetings, and I'm suspecting, I don't know where those numbers came from that he's using in his ad.
Are
There
you
may have
familiar
been
with what
some-
I'm referring to, though? Like you're familiar with the ads that I'm referring to?
Yeah, I believe I know what you're talking about. The fact that he was supposed to have missed all those meetings about the virus and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I say, maybe there were some subcommittee of meeting of some kind. Maybe there were during a certain, if the numbers are accurate at all. I've seen the other claims though saying that no, his attendance record is really well above average in general. So then I'm not sure where the numbers come from. They could be very selective. Maybe they were during a certain year, certain month, certain kinds of committees where not much was happening. And frankly, let me be kind of back up here. You hear those kind of charges made during a lot of campaigns. And frankly, if you're an elected official, and this is both in Lansing and in Washington too, there's a lot of meetings and votes that happen that, to be perfectly honest, aren't of great consequence. And you've got often better things to do back in your home district or back in your office that are more important. So if you're voting on a resolution to declare it National Pickle Week, you might decide to miss that vote and do something more important. And so, I mean, you can selectively pick out those things and get some pretty bad numbers for lawmakers. And as far as I know, yeah, I'm not aware that. I think Peter's record is probably above average in terms of being the workhorse, and I suspect those are very selective numbers. I think.
Hey, Paul, somewhat along the lines of Nick's question, in England, they authorized Parliament to meet remotely and to do proxy voting, both during the pandemic, but also situations where people were very sick or maybe in labor. But both in Congress and in Lansing, there's been strong reluctance to have remote voting or proxy voting. They did pass proxy voting in the House. I know Rep. Kildee was Rep. Lewis's proxy vote when he was sick. But in the Senate and in Lansing, that's not been the case. And I'm thinking not just for the pandemic, but even from a continuity of government in case there were a true national emergency. Is that something that you think should happen or potentially could happen as a possibility in the future?
I think a good question. I think it's well worth considering. I mean, considering we've done that now for so many other public meetings. I mean, city councils and other kind of public meetings all are doing the Zoom style meetings. Certainly during the current time, I think so. And when you think about it, I mean, you can make a decent argument that with modern technology, yeah, the ceremony of having everybody there makes a lot of sense. Maybe there are times when you ought to have everybody there for certain votes, but I can see a very good case to be made that for a lot of routine business, there probably can be a good case to be made for making that, if not universal, at least an optional practice for some votes in Congress. Whether it's going to happen, I mean, the Senate especially, with the partisan divide, they see that as kind of giving into the Democrats, so they don't want to do that. But the Senate's also more traditional in many ways. But I think you can make a good case for that, and I think it'd be a step in the right direction, probably, from my own point of view.
Excellent. Are there any other questions? Well, Paul, I want to thank you for all.
Glad to be here. Always glad to talk to the groups. It's always a pleasure.
You certainly have done your homework as usual. In appreciation for the time and preparation that you donated for your very educational presentation, the Rotary Club of Flint will make a donation in your name to the Rotary International Foundation for the eradication of polio. We sincerely enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's always good to be here.
All right. We look forward to you coming back.
All right. Enjoy the next 2 weeks before the election.
Hey, Ray?
Yes.
Before you go on to your final remarks, I'd like to make an announcement about next week's meeting. I wanted to, it's going to be about my dog and ethics. We haven't talked about ethics for a while, and it seems like this is a good time right before the election to do this. And we're all going to be involved. So, but the name of our meeting is going to be, I want to be as good as my dog thinks I am. So behind that, we're going to talk about what are ethics and talk about how our club has been ethical, in my opinion, which they have, and to remind us the importance of ethics and how people think about us. So I hope all of you will be there.
All right. Thank you for that. And I'm going to mention it again. First of all, I want to thank Nick for his inspirational message, which I thought was really, really touching and incredible. And Kyle, thank you for introducing our speaker and all the preparation and setup and takedown that you did for us. It was appreciated. Rotarians, be safe, stay warm, and look to open opportunities in order to provide service above self. I look forward to seeing you next week to enjoy our next speaker, Jerry Hill, convincing us that his ethics are beyond reproach. The person that his dog thinks he is.
Did we all bring our dogs?
Have a great weekend, everyone. And we are adjourned.
Thank you, Ray.
Right.
That's better.
It worked.
That's better.
Good job, George.
Absolutely. You fixed the flaw on whatever that little ding was.
Yeah, I don't know. I just turned the volume up on everything. It seemed to work all right.
Very
Appreciate
good
it.
program today. Isn't Paul something? He is terrific.
Yes, he is.
I pushed record, so I'm hoping that meeting got recorded. So I'll try it a little bit later and see how it works. And if it does, Ray, then I'll put together a link that you can send out with your next message, so people can go back and look at that meeting on YouTube or wherever it goes.
Okay, fantastic. You're the technician now, George.
But we got to make sure it works first.